Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Florida's hidden voucher expansion, millions of public education dollars at risk. I'm Sonia Lindell, Director of Communications at Florida Policy Institute. Before we get started today, just a few quick notes. All attendees will be receiving a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to the recording and the slide deck. We will have time for questions at the end of this webinar. At that time, you can ask questions using Zoom Q&A. Please note that we will be waiting till all the presenters have gone to begin answering the questions. We have 3 speakers on today's call. Norín is Senior Policy Analyst and Kids Count Director at Florida Policy Institute, where she focuses on education policy. Norín has more than 30 years of health services research and evaluation experience in Florida and New York. Danielle Farrie is Research Director at Education Law Center, where she maintains an extensive education database and conducts analysis to support litigation and public policy for ELC and partner orgs. And we have McKillip, who is a senior researcher at Education Law Center. She leads ELC's research examining the fairness of state funding systems through analyses of resource equity within states. And just a quick note before I hand it over to Danielle, FPI is an independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit organization. We are dedicated to advancing policies and budgets that improve the economic mobility and quality of life for all Floridians. We do this through research, strategic outreach, coalition building, and policy advocacy. So now I will hand it over to Danielle Farrie, our first speaker for today.
Thank you very much, Sonia. So good morning, I'm Danielle Farrie, Research Director at Education Law Center. ELC, for a little background, is a nonprofit organization working for education equity and justice through litigation, research and policy analysis and advocacy, and strategic partnerships with other educational organizations. So we're here this morning with Florida Policy Institute to discuss our recent report looking at the rapid and perhaps overlooked expansion of vouchers in Florida in the past few years. So even in the national context of increasing privatization of K-12 education, with over half of the states having some type of voucher program, Florida's program really stands out for its size and its breadth. With further expansion on the table, it's increasingly important that we understand the magnitude and the impact of these programs on public education. So before I turn it over to Norín and Mary, who are going to, the report's authors, who are going to walk through the findings, I wanted to paint a quick picture of where Florida stands in the national context of public school funding. So at ELC, we publish an annual report called Making the Grade on the condition of school finance in states across the country. So in this report, we rank and grade states on 3 measures of funding fairness. And Florida consistently falls in the bottom of the rankings on all 3 of our measures. The latest edition of the report, which will be released in a couple weeks, finds Florida with 2 Fs and a D. Florida gets an F on funding level, ranking 44th among the 50 states and DC. Its per pupil funding levels are about $4,000 below the national average. It also gets a D on funding distribution, with a regressive funding system that provides, on average, less funding to its high poverty districts than its low poverty districts. So it also gets an F on funding efforts, making it the third lowest effort to fund its schools when considering K-12 education as a proportion of the state's GDP. So what's even more striking is how far Florida has fallen on these measures over the last decade plus. While the state was expanding privatization through voucher programs, Florida's funding effort towards public schools declined the most of any state. Its funding levels also fell the most, going from a ranking of 30th to 44th, and actually spending less per pupil in 2008 than in 2008 in 2020 in inflation adjusted dollars. the distribution of funds between high and low poverty district has also become somewhat more regressive. So within this context, Florida's choice to drastically expand private school vouchers while at the same time disinvesting in public schools is especially troubling and perhaps no coincidence. I'll turn it over to Norín and Mary, who are going to take us through some background on vouchers and then discuss the findings from the report. Norín, you're muted.
My apologies. So I just wanted to take a moment and talk about Florida's, how we fund education. And Florida is, since 1973, has been endeavoring to ensure that there is equitable funding, equal funding for all students in Florida. So we've been at this for quite a long time. And what it is, it's how we implement our constitutional amendment that requires a uniform system of free public education. And the Florida Education Finance Program, or FEFP as it's called, includes both includes state and local dollars, which not everyone realizes the local contribution. It considers the cost of educating students and including students with higher resource needs, English language learners, special education, things like that. There's an adjustment for things like that. There's adjustments made for geography, and also endeavors to ensure that small rural counties are not left out in the allocation of public education dollars. And these funds, the FEFP, the public funds, fund our traditional public schools, charter schools, and vouchers. So Florida has three different kinds of voucher programs. There are traditional voucher programs, the Florida Empowerment Scholarship for educational options are our example of this. And under this method, the state pays private schools directly for on a per pupil basis, which, as I note, is now equivalent to 100% of the unweighted FTE. We have educational savings account and scholarships for students with disabilities, including those the formerly known as Gardner and McKay scholarships are now rolled into these educational savings accounts, are actually paid to parents who can then use them for approved educational expenses such as tuition, therapeutic supports, and so on. And then finally, tax credit vouchers have been around since 2001, and the way these works are that businesses make donations and they receive a dollar for dollar tax credit for those donations, and they're used to fund these scholarship programs. So just wanted to give you a sense of the different varieties of vouchers that we have, but also I do want to also point out that the eligibility criteria for these vouchers has changed over time, and most recently expanded for the family empowerment schedule scholarships and the tax credit to 375% of the federal poverty level, which is for a family of four is more than $100,000. So it's very generous in its eligibility criteria. The scholarships for students with disabilities don't have an income eligibility. You have to document a disability instead. So just wanted to give you a sense of how those work, and there have been substantial changes in eligibility that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to turn it over to Mary to talk about findings from the report, and then I'll jump back on a little bit later.
Great, thank you. So as Danielle talked about with the national rankings of how Florida is looking, they are one of the lowest in terms of funding their public schools in the nation. However, they're ranking at the top in the public funding of private institutions. So this slide is showing just over the past few years, the increase in the amount of voucher spending of public funds going to private institutions from $832 million in the 2016-2017 year, which is already quite high, up to 1.7 billion in the 2021-22 year. And as Norín mentioned, a huge part of this is, especially in this past school year, is due to the expansion of who qualifies and is eligible for the family empowerment scholarships, including allowing higher income students and students who do not have a history of attending a public school in Florida being able to participate. So in the last school year, 820 million just for the family empowerment scholarship was redirected from public state aid to the private schools. So if we could go to the next slide. So this slide focuses specifically on the funding that is coming out of the school funding formulas in state aid to private schools. And that includes, just in the most recent school year, the McKay Scholarship, which is the light blue here, was folded into the Florida Empowerment Scholarship, but it is separated out up until this school year. So with this, you see the latest budget. This is all numbers from the latest budget reports through the Florida Department of Education. By the 2022-23 school year, the current school year, we're looking at 1.3 billion in state aid moving from public funds to private schools. And this is in addition to the tax credit voucher funds that Norín noted that may be up to 1.1 billion in additional general state revenue that could move to the private schools in this current school year. Next slide. So this is just a screenshot of what a page of the Florida Department of Education budget reports look like. This is for the current school year. So it's the second calculation, which means these numbers may increase and change over by the end of the school year. But currently, this is just a snapshot of where we found this information from. So this page shows you, for example, Broward is estimated to receive 879 million in state aid funding through the school funding formula. And at this calculation, 119.5 million in an adjustment for the voucher program for the Family Empowerment Scholarship is being redirected. The state aid is being redirected to private schools, leaving Broward with 759 million in state aid. And a link to all these reports can be seen. You can get at them at the bottom of the slide here. But I just wanted to highlight, this is where the information came from. It came from the Florida Department of Education website. And it is directly coming out of the state aid of the funding formula here. Next slide. So as in the last slide, that was the second calculation. So the Florida Department of Education puts out a set of budget reports over the course of the school year. So this chart is showing over the course of the 2021-2022 school year, what the redirection of public state aid to private schools looked like over the course of the year. So in the first calculation that came out in April 2021, before the school year started, as school districts are thinking about and working on their budget for the coming school year, no funds were reported as heading from the public school districts to the private voucher programs. By the second calculation, shortly before school started, the number was up to 434 million in public funds headed toward the private institutions. Then by the third calculation, halfway through the school year, that number more than doubled to $1.1 billion. So districts that they have to set their fixed costs at the beginning of the year, most of the funding of what districts spend their money on are things like teacher salaries that you can't simply slash midway through the year because you are having all these funds suddenly redirected to different schools. So this is just sort of a showing how difficult this can be, on top of the funds being redirected, that the timing of the way the funding is moving can be really difficult on the districts in making their budgets. Next slide. So we have on the online report that there's the link at the bottom there. Norín, do you want to go ahead and click on that and see if we can actually go into the report? So we have these interactive maps that you can see over from the 2019-2020 school year through 22-23, how the amount of funding that has been redirected from public to private schools has increased by district. And so there is definitely a variation in which districts are being hardest hit. And so as Norín is hovering over, you can see that we've got you can see the details for each district. So you can tell by how dark the coloring is of the district where the more extreme, where more of the budget is going towards the private school voucher programs. But you can also hover over and look at what exactly the percent is and over time. So for example, this is Miami-Dade 2022-23 school year, that an estimated 225 million in voucher expenditures are headed in state aid towards the private schools, which represents 8% of the district's state and local school funding formula funding, and a total of 18% if you were just looking at it as state aid. And if you go, Norín, I don't know if you can click on the 2019-2020 school year, we could just compare that for Miami. So it was 225 million. This year, back in the 2019-2020 school year, was 65 million, representing just 2% of the school district's budget. So it has been a dramatic change. Miami is one of the big ones, largest and one of the largest proportion of their funding. We can go back to the slides now.
And I just wanted to point out too, and you know, as Mary said, you're welcome to go and play around with the, look at all the data, either in the interactive map, or it's also contained in the appendix of our report. But just to, I picked a few counties. Mary talked about Miami-Dade and how much is being expended as a proportion both of combined state and local funding. So for Miami, it's 18% of state funding, which is the localities contribute the majority of education funds, or 7.7% of total state and local funding. Palm Beach similarly has, they also have a large proportion of their state funding that's being diverted to voucher programs. 4.5% of total state and local, or 12.8 of just, if you're just considering the state funding contribution. And then Sarasota County, they spend 4.2% of their combined state and local EFP funding, or nearly 23% of their state funding. And the reason in part that I picked these is that all of these counties have recently either re-upped, reauthorized additional local tax dollars to be allocated to schools. And these are just 3. Florida voters pretty consistently are in support of using local tax dollars for education, and many have had these referenda in their counties. And this, even just in November and in the primary races over the summer, there were, I think, probably 10 or 12 total counties that either reauthorized their funding, such as Palm Beach, or have approved new funding for schools from either property millage is a pretty common way that people do, or through sales tax, such as Pasco County. So Florida voters are pretty, are very much in support of local funding for education, which is why we're asking, we want to highlight the fact that it's not just state dollars being redirected to private education, but funds that people think are going to public schools are actually also being considered in the calculations and being diverted to private schools. So just to sort of summarize where we're at with respect, to summarize our findings, the amount of public funding spent on private education has grown tremendously in the last 4 years, and particularly with the expanded eligibility in the last couple years. And Mary made that very point example, Miami, how much things have changed just over those 4 years. And so in this school year, $1.3 billion will be redirected from public schools to private education, which is 10% of the total state funding for kindergarten through high school education funds. And these are funds that are our tax dollars that would otherwise be used to improve our schools. And then there are, it's not even just these monies that are coming directly out of state coffers, but the Florida tax credit adds another $1.1 billion to that is just never makes it to general revenue. So there's no opportunity to use it to improve our public schools or any other governmental purpose. And it's especially problematic for school districts who have no control over the front door, and that the information on the expenditures for these vouchers comes in after they have already developed their budgets. So it makes it very difficult to manage the school district. And as you see, it's not an insignificant amount of money that's being redirected from school districts' budgets, and ranges up to 9% of their total FEF FEFP budget allocations are the estimates for this school year. And I don't know if you wanted to add to that, Mary? Okay. So the implications of this, some of them may seem are obvious, that huge amounts of budgets are being redirected out of public schools, but there are other implications. The private school sectors, they don't have the same accountability requirements. These are, and it's being expanded. The free and appropriate education of students is not a guarantee in private schools as it is in public schools. We know from other states, vouchers in other states, that voucher programs increase segregation and establishes really two systems of government, of education, which is in violation of the Florida Constitution, which guarantees a uniform system of education. And other things that people don't realize is that federal Title I dollars are also redirected to private schools. So it's not even just our state tax dollars and our local tax dollars that are being affected, but Title I funds from the federal government are also being redirected to private schools that would otherwise be used to improve the public education system in Florida. And I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Mary or Danielle. Okay.
Well, I would just say in terms of, sorry, Norín.
No, please.
Jumped in a little late there, but just, to the first point regarding the accountability, that this is a really important point, that we have a lot of measures in place of accountability for public schools and how they're doing and how students are doing and other things like preventing discrimination and all these various components that private schools are not required to do. And so when we're moving a lot of students into private school and are funding them with public funds, there's no measure of whether those students are indeed getting a good education and whether the resources are going where they should, and all those measures that really help us to know how our students are doing in their schools and whether they're learning.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would just add too that the lack of transparency on the state side in terms of identifying more information about the types of students who may be participating in the voucher program makes it very difficult to assess exactly how much segregation or discrimination is happening. We don't have readily available data about students who seek vouchers and then maybe for whatever reason return to the public school system, perhaps because they were pushed out of their private school for issues that were already raised earlier, discrimination against gender, sexuality, all of those kinds of issues. So the fact that the state is putting so much money into these private school systems without any accountability, both in terms of academic outcomes and the treatment of students and the sort of movement of students into and out of that sector is very troubling.
Yeah, indeed. Yep. So just to provide our recommendations, overall, our recommendation is to keep public funds in public schools and increase the transparency and accountability of the voucher program and outcomes and of students and students moving back and forth. We recommend for halting any further expansion of eligibility And actually elimination would be preferable so that we can really support our public schools. In the absence of, of completely eliminating vouchers, cap the amount of funds that can be awarded so that school districts have time to plan and manage their budgets, which currently they don't. And as we pointed out, the amounts of money being siphoned from their budgets to private schools comes after their budgets are established, published, and approved. And we also need to support the public schools who don't have the ability to cover their fixed costs. And also the voucher programs tend to concentrate students with high resource needs in the public schools, and there is an added compensation to support that and ensure that all students have the opportunities to succeed. There are some things that bear watching this legislative session, and so we're gonna most recently the newly adopted House rules established a new subcommittee to the Standing Education and Employment Committee, which is called the Choice and Innovation Subcommittee. So I just want to point this out for folks to keep an eye out. You can go to the Florida House and follow the activities of this subcommittee to see what are the bills that come before it and advocate accordingly. We don't know who the leadership and the membership is yet. That has not yet been identified. So stay tuned on that one. We also want to support advocacy on this issue and awareness. We undertook this to help raise awareness of the large scale diversion of public school funding. Excuse me. And the fact that it is not limited to state funds, that local funds, including those acquired through referenda, are being diverted to private schools. So sharing this report and its findings with your networks would be greatly appreciated. We also want to help raise awareness among legislators who also, a lot of them are brand spanking new, and oops, I'm so sorry. So we need to help raise awareness amongst the legislators, and stay tuned for some one-pagers that we'll make available and that you can use to advocate with individual legislators in the upcoming session when that kicks off in January. And then stay tuned. We are putting together an action network page on our website, floridapolicyinstitute.org. And so keep your eyes on that, and we will be updating that with action items that folks will be able to take as the session rolls out. And then I think, are there any final thoughts before we turn it over for question and answers? No? Okay. Great.
Okay, so it looks like we have some questions in Zoom Q&A already. There is one question about captions for this webinar, and we did not have those turned on, but let me see what I can do about that in post. And it might take a few more days, but we will make sure that the YouTube version has captions to go along with it. So hopefully that helps.
Our apologies.
Yes, sorry about that. What kind of accountability for Title I funds must be filed by private schools?
I don't know that off the top of my head, Susan, but if you want to send me an email, I can look that up for you. Our information is on the next slide, but it's I'm at dollard@floridapolicy.org.
Okay, the next question is if FPI will be doing a follow-up report on academic and fiscal accountability of voucher programs, given the loose financial oversight by Step Up and the lack of common norm referenced parallel to FAST.
I mean, fiscal accountability is definitely more in our wheelhouse. And so we don't have an immediate plan to do that, but I mean, that's something that, conceivably we would do. Working on the academic accountability piece is something that, while we would point that's something that we definitely are aware of, that we would need to work with some of our other partners who are more involved and more savvy about educational assessment, and especially as we move to the new assessment process. And I'm just hogging all the answers, so go ahead, Danielle and Mary too. Please jump in.
Well, I think that's a great idea to do some reporting on the accountability of the voucher programs. The tricky thing with that, as we noted, is if no one is required to publicly report any of this information, it's very hard to know what's going on. And I think that's a real problem that we've got, is making sure that, as Norín noted, one of the things to do is really increase the transparency and accountability so that we can access some of this information and be able to not just research it, but just for the general public, folks in the community wanting to know what the best option is for them and how their schools are doing, that information be out there. It's really important.
Okay, next question. Are the examples of Arizona and Tennessee useful?
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure. I mean, I think Florida is actually the state that probably has the longest history of running such an broad voucher program. But in Tennessee, they just recently enacted a voucher program. It was tied up in the courts for a number of years, and unfortunately, they got an unfavorable ruling from our perspective just before the holidays that is going to allow those education savings accounts to continue. So, I mean, we at ELC are certainly keeping an eye on both of those states. And Arizona has a history of vouchers, but more recently just sort of really just opened up the whole state to a truly universal voucher program with no criteria for eligibility. So I think we're always sort of stuck in this position where we have to sort of wait again to see like what data come in about the, how these voucher programs are operating and what potential problems we see, but it's something that we're definitely keeping an eye on both places.
Thank you. Next question, do capital improvements have a separate budget area in FEFP?
Yes. And I should note, I mean, some of the local referenda do are specifically for capital improvement projects. Different communities have targeted those funds to different things. So some of them are targeted towards, let's say, teacher salary and improvements in that way. So it really, that's sort of a local decision whether they seek the local referenda, what they're supporting with their dollars.
Okay, there is a question about the URL for the interactive map. So I'm going to actually just type the answer in, and folks should be able to see that link and have access to it.
And it is, let me see, it is on our website as well. And I put our website there, as well as the Education Law Center's website, where it is also posted. We cross-posted it. And so the maps are all there.
And they're directly embedded within the report itself. So you want to go to the Florida report, and then you just scroll down and you'll find the interactive charts within the report. There is a link within the slideshow, so when the deck goes out, you can access it there too.
Right.
Next question, asking if we plan to have a press conference and use media to tell our voting public about this. And there's an example given in Miami. Folks just voted for a property tax assessment for teacher salaries.
Right.
And voters were unaware about the significant diversion of funds to private schools. And we did hold a press conference for media. It was, I want to say 2 months ago now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that did get some good coverage. So I think the issue is definitely out there. And on behalf of FPI and Education Law Center, it's something we're going to be continuing to talk about and push out information about. So, when we send the slide deck around in the recording, I can include a few links to some of the press around that resulted from that conference, if that's helpful. How are our public schools managing? Have criteria been established to do that?
I'm not sure criteria. I'm not sure I understand the criteria aspect of that.
So
I guess, like, has the state provided any guidance, right, on how the districts can deal with these, what do you call them? The deductions from their state aid? I would assume no.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any, that's for sure. Any
Our
particular guidance. It may exist, I don't know.
I was gonna just mention that on the previous webinar, we had a superintendent who was, speaking about the difficulties of managing this already, and assuming that the problem is going to be getting worse. So it's certainly something that superintendents are being forced to deal with. They don't have an option. I mean, their budget is their budget, and so they're, if it comes to this point, they are forced to make decisions about where to cut funds in order to meet the budget that they are given to work with. So even it's a similar story in a lot of school choice programs, right? Like when you lose students, whether it's a handful or a whole bunch, it's difficult, because if it's just a handful, it's hard to find the savings to match those students and the dollars that they are attached to going out the door. You can't fire a teacher or lay off one teacher to make up for 10 students leaving a building, because you still need to operate every single classroom. So it's just an ongoing struggle that unfortunately school district leadership has been dealing with for years and years, but this is obviously an extra stress on them right now. And so I think we'll definitely see going forward more stories about potential cuts to programs and services as districts are forced to deal with this diversion of public funds.
And the other thing is, I mean, if you're interested, it's on the press conference that we had. We included some of our partners in this work, including the Southern Poverty Law Center, Superintendent Hannah from Leon County, the League of Women Voters, both state and the Hillsborough County chapters, and the Alliance for Public Schools were all part of a press conference that we did in September, which is, I know it's on our Facebook page, and I think it's also on our YouTube channel, if you're interested in checking that out. to give you a little different perspective on the work too.
Great, thank you. And yes, as Norín mentioned, we did a Facebook Live, so there is a recording of that on our Facebook page. So there's a decent amount of questions still. We'll get through as many as we can in the allotted time. Do you tend to see referenda approving the diversion of local taxes in districts that are poorer performing and or higher poverty?
We actually are including that as some of our next steps in trying to get those exact data to look at the demographics in relationship to voucher expenditures. So we don't have an exact date for that, but it's something we're definitely considering as a next step.
Great, thank you, Norín. We have a question on the approximate number of school-aged children in public K through 12 schools versus voucher schools.
Right, we are also working. That would be something that we would include for exact numbers. Somebody also has a question on the private schools that are funded, and you can look that up on the DOE website, the schools that are receiving funds.
And I'll just, regarding the number of voucher students, the Florida Department of Education has put out some numbers of students for certain of the scholarships that now are on their way out. But the data is not up to date, and the Florida Empowerment Scholarship one in particular has not been updated recently. So we really don't have a good sense of exact number of students currently, and that number, because we've had this tremendous growth, there has been a huge change. And so that is an important question, as Norín said, that we're really trying to get a handle on, is who are these students and where are they located? Were they ever in the public school system? So many questions that we have about what is happening that we would like answers to, and we'll keep digging and seeing what we can find.
Great, thank you, Mary. Next question, kind of along the same vein, for particular districts, are there lists of how much is paid to private schools by school name or category, religious, elementary versus middle versus high, et cetera?
I believe the schools themselves are listed. I'm pretty sure on the DOE website. I'm happy to find that exact link if you want to.
But we don't know exactly which students from which districts are going
Right,
to.
we don't know
which
that, just the
schools.
schools.
There's not
Yeah.
a way to crosswalk the individual districts where they're sending their students. Not yet, anyway, right?
Is there a way
Right.
to filter with the school names, like filter by if it's a religious school versus the charters that aren't, for example? Maybe not.
I think because
not
the
sure.
funds aren't going directly to the schools, that's tricky, because you're talking about
it.
there's the middleman, the intermediary, the step up for students, right? That is sort of managing the money and handling all of that. So that's a matter of their transparency with them releasing information.
Okay, that makes sense. Norín, you already touched on this about resources that give insight into who the big investors are in private schools that take advantage of public money. I think this is what you were kind of alluding to before.
And there's another piece to that too. Initially, and the Florida League of Women Voters Action Team, under direction of Dr. Butzin, put together a report on some of the accountability issues, and she notes that her team notes that whereas initially with the Florida tax credits, they were publishing the names of the companies that had taken advantage of those tax credits, but there was subsequent legislation that ended that. So it's even less clear who the folks are who are taking advantage of those particular kinds of tax credits than there was initially. There's not a lot of info about accountability.
Okay, next we have a question about Betsy DeVos pushed vouchers, and she is partnered with Koch brothers and John Walton to take vouchers nationwide and eventually eliminate the Department of Education. Is Florida looking at the trends nationwide of lobbyists and the push to undermine the Department of Ed?
I can only assume yes, but I do not know for sure.
One thing, this doesn't directly answer the question, but one of the groups at the Education Law Center is the Public Funds, Public Schools, that does work looking at vouchers and their impact nationwide. And so it does a lot with various states and stuff. I mean, maybe we can include a link to their website when we send out information after the call, that they would be a group to follow and to keep an eye on what is happening more nationally in terms of vouchers.
Great, thank you so much. Next question, what explains discrepancies in academic performance and funding across schools within a school district? Does this have to do with diversion of funds?
A big question.
Yeah.
There's obviously a lot of factors that go into student performance outcomes. One of the biggest factors is the resources. The ones that we have the most control over is the resources that are provided to those schools to make sure that students have the academic and social supports that they need. Just because the district allocations do not necessarily mean that every school within the county is funded at the same level. It's not something that I have done a ton of work on in Florida in particular, so I don't want to sort of speak out of turn, but just nationally, we know that, just like there are between district disparities in funding, there are also within district disparities in funding. And so some schools may be benefiting from the allocation of state and local funds. Some schools also might be benefiting from fundraising and other opportunities that families help support their public schools in wealthier areas. They just have better opportunities. And of course, the underlying factor in a lot of the achievement gap issues that we see across the country is poverty, and students who are dealing with the issues associated with poverty. It obviously bleeds into their academic environment, and far too infrequently do schools actually have the resources that they need to support those students. So, one of the main tenets that we include in our school funding report that I was speaking about at the top of the presentation is, the idea that schools must be funded progressively. So it's not enough to give every school within a county the same amount of funding if there are disparities in the characteristics of the students. So if one school has a very high need population, that school should be getting more funding than this neighboring school that might have a low need population. So there's just a lot of factors that go into making sure that funding is equitable and not just equal across schools.
Great, thank you, Danielle. Next question, how does the funding for charter schools fit into traditional public school funding and the private school funding?
Well, charter schools are considered public schools, and so they get their allocations of FEFP funding as public schools do. And then vouchers, as the vouchers come directly also. Everybody, they get their students FTE payments according to the number of students that they have. So public schools, if they have 100, they get 100 times whatever the FTE allocation is. Vouchers, the same. Public schools, charters, they all get it based on their head count, which is why that's an important time of the year for schools. And now all three of them, they get the same amounts for the number of students that they have. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Norín. Next question, does the Family Empowerment Scholarship pay the full tuition of the students' enrollment in the private school? Or are participating schools allowed to charge the families supplementary tuition?
They can. I mean, the voucher, the value of the voucher is so much, it's so much money. So if the school's tuition is more, then parents would have to make up that difference. And not every private school will accept vouchers either. So I mean, that's up to the schools themselves to decide whether they want to do that.
Okay, next we have, where do the funds paid to Step Up and other intermediaries appear in the state education budget?
Oh, that's a good question. I'd be happy to send you that information. I don't know it off the top of my head, but I'm not sure what the exact line item is, but you can definitely look up how much the allocations are based on FTE. So I'd be glad to send you that info if you want to send me a note.
I mean, I think that's sort of one of the issues that we were trying to raise with this report, right? Is that if you were just looking at the state budget on the annual budget, you wouldn't necessarily see the increase in funds going to these voucher programs because they're sort of buried, right? So that the funding for the FEFP funding for these voucher programs that we're speaking about in this report are not a line item in the state budget. They're just a part of the FEFP education budget. So you can't, if you're looking at that broad document, you can't disentangle whether it's actually going to public schools or whether it's then subsequently being diverted to the private system. And so that's how, Mary dug into the individual FEFP reports. You have to kind of really dig deep into the funding calculations to determine how much money is truly going to the public system versus how much is being diverted out.
Great, thank you. So the next question I think has to do with another attendee's question about the Miami referendum. And this question is, my impression of the Miami referendum was that revenues would be shared per statute with charter schools, but not with voucher schools. What evidence is there that they are sharing with private schools? And I don't believe this is something specifically that we covered. I think this was a previous question during this webinar about the specific Miami referendum, correct?
Yeah, I'd have to look at the exact language of the referendum to figure that out. I don't know.
Okay, so we would have to get back to you on that. And when we noted about the press conference earlier, and I think that was mentioned after the question about Miami referendum, the press conference we held was on the findings of the report generally. It wasn't on, it wasn't in Miami or specific to that region. It was just a statewide press conference we had held.
And I don't know if this addresses the question, but I do, with our report, with the legislation that we were looking at for the Family Empowerment Scholarship, it is specified that the funding is strictly state aid. going from public to private. But I think as Norín spoke a bit about, and it's a little confusing, but because the school funding formula, the allocations for districts is state and local dollars, and then the funds are taken out in state aid for that, for each student, it ends up hitting the local funding as well. So even though the money is just state aid, it does affect sort of the overall budget picture.
Thank you, Mary. And I realize now we are at time. There were a few remaining questions, and so apologies that we weren't able to get through all of them. Thank you to Mary, Norín, and Danielle for all the great information you presented. And a reminder that we will be sending a link to the recording and the slide deck tomorrow to all attendees. So any other closing thoughts?
No, I just really appreciate everyone taking the time this morning, and please reach out if you have those of you who had outstanding questions. We can certainly answer those one-on-one.
Thanks, Norín. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.